There was an article that was purported to have been written by her in one of the magazine, one of the Star or whatever those terrible things are, in which she made certain assertions and accusations that none of us ever believed a word.
There is a moment burned into the memory of every television historian who has ever studied the rise and fall of American sitcoms. It happened on a Tuesday night in May of 1984, in living rooms across the United States, where millions of families gathered around their television sets to say goodbye to a show that had been part of their weekly lives for over a decade. The moment was quiet. It was gentle. It was delivered by a man sitting in a familiar living room, looking directly into the camera, and speaking words that no television character had ever dared speak before. Howard Cunningham, the warm and steady patriarch of Happy Days, broke the invisible wall between fiction and reality, thanked America for sharing 11 years with his family, and raised a glass to Happy Days. Viewers cried. Critics were stunned. And for one brief, shining moment, it seemed like Happy Days had pulled off the perfect farewell. Then ABC ruined it. What followed that emotionally devastating finale is one of the most bizarre and self-destructive decisions in American broadcast history. A series of forgotten, displaced episodes were quietly loaded back onto the airwaves like pieces of furniture returned to a house that had already been sold. The funeral had been held. The flowers had wilted. And yet, there was the Cunningham family again, alive on screen, cracking jokes and driving their old car through the streets of Milwaukee as if Tom Bosley had never looked into that camera and broken everyone's heart. The damage was permanent. The legacy was fractured. And the question that television scholars still debate today is a simple one. How did a network manage to take one of the most beloved shows in American history and strangle its own golden goose? To understand the answer, you have to go back further than May of 1984. You have to go back to the beginning of that final season, when ABC was riding high on a piece of programming real estate that every network in America envied. They had secured the exclusive broadcast rights to the 1984 Winter Olympics in Sarajevo, Yugoslavia. This was enormous. Olympic coverage in that era was not merely a ratings event. It was a cultural moment. Families planned their evenings around it. Advertisers paid staggering sums to be associated with it. ABC executives saw it as the crown jewel of their winter schedule, and they were not wrong to be proud of it. The Sarajevo Games ran from February 8th through February 19th, clearing out entire blocks of primetime programming to make room for figure skaters, ski jumpers, and ice hockey matches that had Americans glued to their screens. But that clearing of the schedule created a problem. Happy Days, in its final season, had episodes ready to air. Episodes that had been written, shot, edited, and scheduled as part of the show's farewell run. When the Olympics bumped those episodes off their intended broadcast dates, ABC faced a decision that should have been straightforward. The simple solution was obvious to almost everyone except the people in charge of making it. Delay the finale. Let the remaining episodes air in their proper sequence. Give the show the unbroken runway it deserved for its final approach. Instead, ABC chose a different path. They kept the May finale date locked in, aired the series ending on schedule, and quietly set aside the displaced episodes with vague plans to deal with them later. The finale itself, titled Passages, aired on May 8, 1984, and it was everything a decade-long television relationship deserved. Joni and Chachi became engaged, offering fans the romantic resolution they had been quietly rooting for since the earliest days of their courtship. Fonzie, the leather-jacketed icon who had turned a supporting role into a cultural phenomenon, officially adopted a young boy named Danny, a storyline that softened the Fonz's rough edges in the most emotionally satisfying way imaginable. The wedding bells, the family gathering, the sense of time passing and love enduring, all of it worked beautifully. Creator Gary Marshall had insisted on a finale that honored the audience's intelligence and emotional investment, and he got it. But the centerpiece of that finale, the scene that people still talk about when they talk about Happy Days, was the moment Marshall had nearly been forbidden from including. ABC executives had fought hard against it. In meeting after meeting, they had told Marshall that the idea was too risky, too unconventional, too likely to confuse and alienate the viewers who had spent 11 years treating the Cunninghams like real neighbors. What Marshall wanted to do was have Howard Cunningham break the fourth wall. He wanted Tom Bosley's character to look directly into the camera and speak to the audience as themselves, not as characters watching through a window, but as actual human beings who had given their Tuesday nights and their emotional energy to this family for over a decade. Network executives shook their heads. Television simply did not do that kind of thing. The agreement between a scripted show and its viewers depended on a mutual pretense, the pretense that the cameras were invisible, that the living room on screen was a real living room, that the people speaking were not actors on a soundstage in Hollywood. Marshall pushed back. He believed the audience had earned something more than a conventional goodbye. He believed that the relationship between Happy Days and its viewers was not a passive one. Families had genuinely grown up alongside Richie Cunningham. They had worried about Fonzie's loneliness and celebrated his small moments of vulnerability. They had seen Marion Cunningham model a kind of patient, loving motherhood that felt both aspirational and comfortingly real. To end the show with a standard episode, however well-crafted, felt to Marshall like shaking hands with someone you had hugged for 11 years. It was technically correct but emotionally dishonest. After extended and reportedly tense negotiations, ABC relented. The scene was filmed. And when it aired on the night of May 8th, something remarkable happened. Tom Bosley looked into that camera and spoke words that were simple, direct, and devastating in their sincerity. He talked about his children growing up and starting lives of their own. He talked about how he and Marion had not climbed mountains or written famous books, but had raised 2 wonderful kids and watched them grow into loving adults. And then he thanked the audience. He thanked the people at home for being part of the family. He raised his glass. He said, "To Happy Days." And across the country, in those living rooms where families had gathered, people cried. Not because the show was sad, but because it was over, and because the farewell had been given with such warmth and such directness that it felt like a real goodbye from people they actually knew. Critics who initially raised an eyebrow at the sentimentality of the moment were gradually won over by the audience response. Letters poured in. Television writers pointed to the scene as evidence that finales could be both experimental and profoundly moving. Directors and showrunners began referencing it as a benchmark. The Happy Days finale, and specifically Tom Bosley's camera-breaking speech, entered the permanent record of great television moments. And then ABC opened the vault. Between June and September of 1984, 5 episodes that had been displaced by the Olympic scheduling conflict were broadcast on ABC without any meaningful context or explanation. The first of these, which aired in early June, dropped into the television landscape with all the grace of a dropped dinner plate. Viewers who had cried at Bosley's farewell speech, who had processed their grief and moved emotionally forward, suddenly found the Cunningham family back on their screens, apparently unaware that they had already said goodbye. The tonal whiplash was extraordinary. It was not merely confusing. It was actively distressing to the audience's sense of narrative and emotional reality. Each subsequent episode compounded the damage. Happy Days had been, at its best, a show about continuity and warmth. The safety of its 1950s Milwaukee setting was precisely the point. It offered audiences an escape into a world where problems were solved within 30 minutes, families stayed together, and the local diner was always open. The post-finale episodes could not function within that emotional framework because the framework had already been dismantled. The farewell had already been given. To return to those characters now felt not like a gift but like a haunting. The final broadcast episode of Happy Days, which aired in September 1984, was a storyline involving Fonzie attempting to join Howard's Leopard Lodge, only to be subjected to petty hazing from Potsy. It was, by any measure, an undignified ending for a character who had spent 11 seasons being the coolest person in every room he entered. Arthur Fonzarelli, the man who could fix a jukebox with a single well-placed punch, who had become a genuine piece of American cultural mythology, went out as the butt of a joke engineered by one of the show's most comedically minor characters. There was no emotional resonance. There was no closure. There was nothing that acknowledged what the show had meant or what its ending should have honored. The contrast between that September broadcast and the May finale is so sharp that it almost defies belief. Television producers and network executives who watched the situation unfold at the time described it in terms that ranged from baffled to furious. The industry understood, even in 1984, that a finale was not simply a programming block. It was a cultural agreement. When a show ended, it ended. Audiences needed that ending to be final in order to properly grieve the loss and move on. By violating that finality, ABC did not give Happy Days fans more of what they loved. They contaminated what they had already been given. The consequences for the television industry were real and lasting. Other networks, watching the fallout from ABC's handling of the Happy Days conclusion, began building protections into their programming agreements. The concept of finale integrity became a genuine consideration in contract negotiations. The idea that a series ending could not be undermined by scheduling conflicts or bonus content began to carry actual legal and contractual weight in Hollywood. The lesson was painful but clear. You could spend 11 years building something extraordinary, and you could then destroy its legacy in a single summer of careless programming decisions. What makes the Happy Days story particularly poignant is that the show had survived so much before that final stumble. It had weathered the near departure of its lead actor when Ron Howard threatened to walk away over the network's attempt to rename the series. It had survived the challenge of building a show around an ensemble when every commercial instinct in Hollywood was screaming to put Fonzie at the center of everything and call it a day. It had even survived the mid-series challenge of replacing major cast members and refreshing its storytelling without losing the qualities that made it special in the first place. After all of that, it did not fail from within. It was not cancelled for poor ratings or creative exhaustion. It ended on its own terms, with a finale that is still regarded as one of the genuinely moving series conclusions in American television history. And then it was walked back. Quietly. Without ceremony. Without apology. Henry Winkler, reflecting on the end of the series years later, spoke about the strangeness of the post-finale period with characteristic honesty. The show's conclusion had already been difficult for him personally, representing not just the end of a professional chapter, but a genuine identity crisis for a man who had spent a decade living inside one of television's most iconic characters. To have that already complicated farewell further muddied by the broadcast of leftover episodes added an additional layer of unresolved feeling to what was already an emotionally charged passage in his life. Tom Bosley's real passing in 2010 was mourned across the country with an intensity that spoke to how deeply his portrayal of Howard Cunningham had embedded itself in the American consciousness. That outpouring of grief was a testament to the power of the farewell he had delivered in May of 1984. The speech he gave looking into that camera had done its work. It had created a genuine emotional bond between a fictional character and a real audience, a bond strong enough to survive decades. The tragedy is that ABC's subsequent decisions made it harder for that bond to be the clean and lasting thing it should have been. The scene that effectively took Happy Days off the air for good was not the finale. The finale was beautiful.